I suppose I should begin with the silence, because silence has been my only steady companion for the last several years, heavier than the clock ticking on the wall or the groaning of the old house that has sheltered me longer than any person alive. My name is Lawrence Harlow, though most people in town just call me Larry if they call me anything at all, and I am 79 years old. A widower, a veteran of a war that now feels like it happened on another planet, and a man who wakes each morning with the same dull question in his chest. How did I come to this life where the voices of my own family, my son and his wife, are rarer than the voices of birds outside my window? When Helen, my wife of 53 years, passed away from pneumonia one bitter January night, I thought the ache of losing her would be the greatest pain I would ever endure, but time has shown me that grief does not stop at the grave. It continues. In the living, in how they remember or fail to remember you, in how children, once carried in your arms, can turn their eyes away as though your presence were a burden too heavy for them to acknowledge. My days are stitched together by routines that might seem pitiful to someone younger, but to me are lifelines. I wake before the sun, because sleep has become fragile, easily disturbed by memories or the stiffness in my knees. I shuffle into the kitchen, boil water for coffee, and take my time measuring the grounds the way Helen used to, though the flavor never comes out right. I sit at the table facing the window that overlooks the yard where the maple tree we planted in 1969 now towers like a silent witness, and I sip slowly, pretending that by prolonging the ritual, I can stretch the hours into something meaningful. After breakfast, I read the newspaper, still printed on thin grey paper that leaves ink on my fingertips, though most of the town has switched to glowing screens. I try the crossword, but often leave it half-finished. Not because I cannot solve it, but because I grow weary of talking to myself in empty rooms. On better days, I drive my old Buick to the grocery store, a machine as aged as I am, squeaking in protest each time I turn the wheel. On worse days, I simply sit in the living room, staring at the photographs on the wall, especially the one of my son, David, when he was 8 years old, holding up the fishing rod with the first trout he ever caught, his face glowing with triumph as Helen clapped her hands behind him. That boy with tousled blonde hair and shining eyes is still the person I think of when I hear my son's name, though the man who now bears it is harder, heavier, impatient, his kindness buried under the weight of bills, ambitions, and disappointments. I live in a one-story house on the edge of town, the same house where David was raised, the same house where Helen cooked Sunday roasts and where neighbors used to gather on summer evenings. Back then, the place was full of life. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of children chasing each other down the hall, the warmth of laughter drifting from the porch. Now the house is more like a museum, filled with relics of a life gone by. The living room still holds Helen's favorite rocking chair, worn smooth at the arms, though no one sits in it anymore. The bedroom closet still carries a faint trace of her perfume, lavender and rose, which sometimes brings tears to my eyes when I brush against one of her old scarves. I have not had the courage to clear it out, though people advise me to do so. They say it would help me move on. But I do not want to move on. I want to remain close to her, even if only through the smell of fabric or the sight of her handwriting on recipe cards. My neighbors are kind in the shallow way people are kind when they are busy with their own lives. They wave, they ask politely how I am holding up, but no one lingers long enough to hear the real answer. A few church friends used to visit, but as the years passed, the visits grew less frequent, and now I'm left mostly with the mailman and the cashier at the supermarket as my main sources of human interaction. My son calls every few weeks, always in a hurry, his voice clipped, as though talking to me were a chore he squeezes between meetings. His wife, Julia, rarely calls at all, though when she does it is usually to remind me about medication or to suggest that perhaps it is time to consider assisted living, words that sting each time because I know they mean she wants the house free. The house I built and maintained with my own hands, the house that carries every memory of my marriage and my youth. They have never said it outright, but I can hear it in the pauses of conversation. This place, this last anchor of my independence, is what they want from me. I spend much time thinking about family, about what the word even means at my age. When I was young, I imagined growing old, surrounded by children and grandchildren, telling stories by the fire, being respected for the sacrifices I made. Yet reality has a cruel way of unraveling such visions. My grandchildren live in another state, and when I send them letters with small checks for birthdays, I seldom receive even a thank you card. Perhaps it is not their fault. They are young, the world is fast, and maybe their parents do not encourage them. But each silence, each absence of a simple phone call is like a small cut that accumulates until you feel carved hollow. I sometimes wonder if I am already a ghost in their lives, someone they will only remember in vague terms when I am gone. Grandpa Larry, wasn't he the one with the old house? The irony is that I am not helpless. I am slower, yes, and my body does not obey me as it once did, but my mind is sharp. I still balance my checkbook, still follow politics, still fix the squeaky hinges on the doors. Yet my son and Julia talk to me as though I were a child who cannot be trusted with scissors. They correct me when I mention dates. They insist I forget things I know I remember. They look at each other with the kind of glances people exchange when humoring someone they believe is slipping. At first I laughed it off, thinking perhaps I had indeed misremembered small details, but gradually I realized it was not about mistakes. It was about power. If they could convince me, or worse, convince others, that I was becoming incompetent, then everything I own, everything I still control, could be taken under the guise of protection. I should not dwell on such suspicions, yet I cannot shake them. Perhaps living alone breeds paranoia, but there are moments late at night when I hear a car slow outside, when I see shadows move across the curtains, and I imagine them already planning, already plotting the paperwork that would strip me of my authority. And then I sit straighter, clenching my fists on the armrests, whispering to myself that I will not be erased, not while I still breathe. So here I am, a man caught between memory and survival, sitting in a house that feels both like sanctuary and prison, holding on to routines that mask the emptiness, telling myself that I still have a voice, even if most days no one wants to hear it. And yet, deep inside, I sense that the quiet life I've been clinging to is nearing a rupture, that the silence will not last forever. There is a storm brewing, not in the sky, but within my own family. And though I dread its arrival, I know it will decide whether I spend my final years in dignity or in disgrace. It was in late spring, one of those deceptive afternoons when the sunlight lays itself across the yard, like a promise that life is still gentle, that trouble is far away, when the phone rang with a kind of abrupt insistence that makes you feel, even before answering, that whatever peace you thought you had is about to be disturbed. I picked it up expecting a telemarketer or perhaps the church committee reminding me of some meeting, but instead it was my son, David, his voice unusually warm, almost rehearsed in its friendliness, asking how I had been and whether I might like some company over the weekend. I should have felt joy, for it had been months since he last set foot in my home, but instead I felt a prickle of suspicion, for sudden kindness from him had always come attached to something else, and the way he cleared his throat before mentioning that Julia would be coming too told me that this visit was not born of nostalgia, but of purpose. They arrived the following Saturday in their gleaming SUV, a machine so polished it seemed to sneer at the cracked driveway it rolled upon. Julia stepped out first, her heels clicking against the concrete, her eyes sweeping across the house with a faint curl of disdain that she never bothered to hide. David followed, heavier than I remembered, carrying the smell of expensive cologne and city offices. his smile wide but thin, the kind of smile that closes quickly once the transaction is complete. They embraced me perfunctorily at the door, Julia holding her purse as though my hallway were too narrow and too dusty for her comfort, and then they entered as though they owned the place, sitting not in the living room where Helen's chair still stands, but at the dining table, spreading papers and folders before even asking how I was. The conversation began with the usual formalities, inquiries about my health, about whether the car was still running, about whether I needed help with the yard. I gave the usual answers, short but polite, yet even as I spoke I saw Julia exchange glances with David, those silent flickers of communication that married couples perfect, and I knew that they were waiting to introduce the real reason for their visit. It came when David leaned forward, folding his hands, speaking in that patient tone adults use with children, telling me that times were uncertain, that my house was too big for me to manage alone, that accidents happen to men of my age, and that the responsible thing would be to arrange matters legally so that, should anything happen, there would be no confusion about ownership or responsibility. Julia slid a document across the table, her nails tapping against the edge of the folder as she explained that it was merely a precautionary measure, a simple power of attorney that would allow them to act on my behalf in case of emergency. I picked up the papers and felt the weight of them in my hands, not heavy in substance, but heavy in implication. The print was small, the language dense, but I have lived long enough to recognize the contours of a trap. Words like transfer and exclusive rights swam before me, and though I am no lawyer, I could see that what they were asking me to sign was no temporary safeguard, but a permanent surrender of the only thing I still possessed that had any value, beyond myself. I placed the papers back on the table slowly, deliberately, and said that I appreciated their concern, but I was not ready to give up control of my home. The air thickened immediately. Julia's smile vanished, replaced by the tight, hard expression of someone denied what they already considered theirs. David sighed, rubbing his temples, speaking with forced calmness about how I was being stubborn, how I did not understand the complexities of modern legal matters, how one fall in the bathtub could leave me incapacitated, and then the state would step in, seizing the house, dragging us all through endless court proceedings. I told him that I had lived long enough to handle my own affairs, that the house was mine and his mother's before me, and that until the day I could no longer sign my own name, no one else would sign it for me. Julia's voice cut sharp across the room then, accusing me of being selfish, of not thinking about the burden I would place upon them, of clinging to control for the sake of pride. She said that families were supposed to trust one another, that I was insulting them by refusing such a simple request. I wanted to shout, to remind them of all the years I'd carried them, of the money I had sent when their debts piled high, of the sleepless nights I had endured praying for their success, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat silently, my hand resting on the worn wood of the table where Helen and I had shared countless meals, and I thought how bitter it was that the same table now bore papers designed to erase me from my own life. David pushed the folder closer again, urging me to at least consider it, but I pushed it back, firmer this time, saying no, not today, not ever. The refusal cracked the veneer of civility. Julia muttered something under her breath about senility, about how it was dangerous to let me live alone. David's voice grew louder, pressing that he was only thinking of my safety, that it was reckless not to plan ahead, but I could hear beneath the words the frustration of a man who needed what I would not give. Their visit, meant to appear as an act of kindness, had revealed itself as an attempt to corner me, and though I felt my heart pounding with both anger and fear, I also felt a clarity, a recognition that this wasn't a passing conversation, but the beginning of something much darker. When they finally left, taking their gleaming car and their folder of papers, the house felt smaller, not because they had occupied it, but because they had left behind an echo of menace. I sat in the living room long after dusk, staring at Helen's chair, wondering what she would have said, whether she would have urged me to trust our son, or whether she would have seen, as I saw, the hunger in their eyes. For the first time in years, the silence of the house did not comfort me. It accused me, whispering that danger had already crossed the threshold and would return. And I knew with a heavy certainty that my refusal was not the end of the matter, but only the catalyst, the first spark in a fire that would soon rage out of my control. The days that followed their visit were heavy with an unease I could not shake, as if the very air in the house had thickened after they left their folder of papers on my table. And though I had pushed it back toward them and told them no, I later discovered that Julia had slipped another copy into my desk drawer, as if assuming that when I was alone and frightened in the dark hours of the night, I might come to my senses and sign. That discovery made me realize how determined they were, and the determination unsettled me, for it meant that my home was no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield waiting for its next skirmish. The phone calls began almost immediately, not every day but often enough that I felt hounded, each one framed as a check-in about my health. But beneath the thin varnish of concern always lay the same question. Had I reconsidered? Had I looked over the papers again? Did I not see how dangerous it was to leave things unsettled? I repeated my refusal each time, sometimes with patience, sometimes with irritation, but no matter the tone, the answer was the same, and each refusal added another stone to the growing wall between us. When at last they appeared again in a person, it was without the pretense of a social call. They arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, Julia carrying grocery bags as though to suggest generosity, though I later saw the bags contained little more than items I'd never asked for. Low-sodium crackers, herbal teas, and sugar-free candy. Things that seemed designed less for my enjoyment than for the argument that I was already in decline. David followed behind her with a clipboard in hand, and as soon as they entered the kitchen, Julia began rearranging my cupboards, discarding cans she claimed were expired, while David asked intrusive questions about how many times I'd fallen in the past year, whether I sometimes forgot to lock the door at night, whether I had trouble remembering names. I told him to put away the clipboard, that I was not a child to be examined, but he only smiled thinly and said he was helping me prepare for what he called inevitable transitions. The humiliation was sharper than I had anticipated. Watching my daughter-in-law discard food I had paid for, listening to my own son scribble notes as though I were a case file instead of his father, I felt stripped of dignity in my own kitchen. I raised my voice at one point, telling Julia to stop throwing away perfectly good cans of soup. And she froze, looked at me with that tight-lipped smile people reserve for the unwell, and said in a condescending tone that if I insisted on keeping spoiled food, perhaps she should call someone who could explain the risks to me more effectively. The implication was clear. If I resisted them too much, they would bring in outsiders, doctors, social workers, perhaps even police, and the weight of officialdom would crush whatever independence I had left. After that morning, things shifted noticeably. They began dropping by more often, always without warning, and each visit carried some new subtle attempt to portray me as incapable. Julia once asked to borrow my keys under the pretense of checking the lock on the garage, and when I asked for them back, she claimed I'd already misplaced them and she had no idea where they were. I knew she was lying, for I had seen her slip them into her purse. But when I confronted her, David intervened, saying perhaps I had simply forgotten. Another time, while I was preparing tea, Julia leaned close to David and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Do you think it's safe for him to handle boiling water on his own?" I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from the kettle but from shame and fury. Yet I swallowed it, knowing that any outburst would only confirm the portrait they were painting of me. Neighbors began to behave differently too, and I understood then that David and Julia were not confining their campaign to the walls of my home. Mrs. Callahan from across the street, who used to chat warmly with me about her roses, suddenly asked with guarded concern whether I had been taking my medication properly, as if she had been told otherwise. At church one Sunday, the pastor made a vague comment during his sermon about the duty to care for our elders when they can no longer care for themselves, and though he did not look directly at me, I felt the eyes of others slide in my direction. It was as if the narrative had already been seeded in the community, the suggestion that I was slipping, that soon it would not be safe for me to remain alone, and once that seed was planted, no matter what I said, the suspicion would grow. The breaking point of this first escalation came on an evening when they insisted on staying for dinner. I cooked a simple meal, roast chicken with potatoes, something I could manage without strain, and as we sat at the table, Julia made a show of cutting my meat into small pieces, saying brightly that it was easier this way, and David laughed as though it were all in good fun. My hands trembled not because I was incapable, but because rage coursed through me, and I wanted to shout that I had carved meat for him countless times when he was a child, that to reverse the roles now in mockery was cruelty, not care. Instead, I pushed back my chair and stood, telling them I was tired, that the visit was over. Julia's eyes hardened, and she said coldly that if I kept behaving this way, making scenes, they might have no choice but to involve the authorities, because clearly I was becoming a danger to myself and perhaps even to others. It was the first time they spoke so plainly, the first time the threat was not veiled in polite words, but stated with the sharp edge of coercion. If you don't calm down, if you don't stop this nonsense, we'll call the police, Julia said, her fork clattering onto the plate like a gavel sealing my sentence. The room seemed to tilt around me then, the walls pressing closer, the silence after her words louder than any argument. I looked at my son, hoping for contradiction, hoping for some flash of the boy I had raised, but he only shifted uncomfortably and said nothing, his silence an endorsement. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the dim light of the living room, staring at Helen's empty chair, feeling the weight of their ultimatum echo through the house. I realized then that the ground beneath me was no longer solid. It had shifted into dangerous territory where every word I spoke, every action I took, could be twisted into evidence against me. They had shown their hand. They were willing to weaponize the law itself, to paint me as unfit, and once the police or the courts were involved, my voice might be drowned out entirely. My refusal to sign their papers had escalated into something larger, something that now threatened not just my dignity, but my very right to remain in my own home. The real fracture came not in one sudden blow, but in a slow accumulation of slights and suspicions that pressed down on me until the night I overheard what I was never meant to hear, the moment when all pretense of family dissolved, and I understood, with the cold certainty of a man watching his own shadow lengthen at dusk, that my son and his wife were not simply misguided in their worry, but deliberate in their schemes, weaving a trap in which I was to be the helpless prey. They had come again under the excuse of helping me sort through old files in the study, though I had not asked for help. And after a long afternoon of patronizing chatter, Julia declared she had left her scarf inside and went back, while David lingered on the porch pretending to fix the loose hinge of the screen door. I followed quietly, more out of habit than suspicion, and as I stepped down the hall I heard Julia's voice through the cracked door of the study, low and urgent, saying that the time had come to stop playing gentle. "He'll never sign willingly," she said, "and if we keep waiting he'll only dig in deeper. We need to make it official, get the doctor to write a statement, then we call social services. If he makes a scene, we call the police and say he threatened us. They'll believe us. Not some stubborn old man who can barely keep track of his keys." I froze in place, my hand gripping the wall, the blood draining from my face as I realized the full weight of what they were plotting. The fragments of condescension, the careful spreading of rumors, the missing keys, the whispers about my forgetfulness, all of it had been groundwork for this larger plan, to build a case against me not in a courtroom of law, but in the courtroom of public opinion, so that when the moment came, no one would doubt their story. David's voice joined hers then, softer, almost weary, as if he hated the necessity but had resigned himself to it. "If he lashes out, it's perfect," he said. "All we have to do is stand back and let the officers see for themselves. They'll file the report, and after that the court will do the rest. He'll be declared unfit, and then the house is ours to manage. We can sell it, cover the debts, finally breathe again. You know as well as I do, we don't have time for another year of waiting." The betrayal in those words struck me deeper than any insult ever could. My own son, the boy I'd held by the hand when teaching him to ride a bicycle, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms, was now calmly discussing the mechanics of erasing me from my life, reducing me to an obstacle to be removed for the sake of his financial relief. I backed away before they noticed me, retreating into the kitchen, my legs trembling so violently I had to grip the counter to remain upright. The kettle on the stove whistled then, shrill and mocking, and I switched it off with a hand that felt no longer like mine. That night, alone after they had left, I walked the house in circles, touching the familiar objects, Helen's chair, the photographs, the maple wood banister, as though trying to anchor myself to the reality that was now under siege. For hours I weighed my options, each one darker than the last. I could confront them openly, but if I raised my voice or accused them, they would twist it into evidence of instability. I could confide in neighbors, but I already sensed the poison of their whispers in the community. And who would believe the desperate story of an old man over the polished certainty of a younger couple respected in town? I could call my grandchildren, but what good would it do when they barely answered my letters, their loyalty long trained to follow their parents' lead? The walls of the house seemed to close in as I considered these options, until finally I sank into Helen's chair and whispered aloud the thought that had been clawing at me all evening. They want me gone. The realization reshaped everything. The missing credit card a week earlier, which I had dismissed as my own carelessness, now burned in my memory as deliberate theft. The insistence that I could not handle cooking, that I might fall, that I was confused, were no longer misguided worries but rehearsed lines in a performance stage to convince the world that I was already lost to age. Even their gifts, the bland groceries, the rearranged cupboards, looked different under this light, less as attempts to help and more as props in a theater of incapacity. I saw myself suddenly not as a father loved, but as a figure in their strategy, a fragile pawn to be maneuvered off the board. In the days that followed, every sound carried menace. When the phone rang late at night, I half expected it to be a voice from social services announcing that someone had filed a concern about my welfare. When I walked down the street to fetch the mail, I caught neighbors' glances that seemed tinged with pity, as if they already considered me halfway to the nursing home. My hands began to shake when signing checks at the bank, not because of weakness, but because I feared the teller might notice and report it. The paranoia, though justified by what I had overheard, gnawed at me until I felt stripped of safety, even in daylight. The midpoint of my ordeal came when I returned one afternoon from the grocery store and found Julia and David waiting on my porch, a manila envelope in David's hands and a forced cheerfulness in their voices. They said they had arranged for a notary to visit later that week, just in case, and that all I needed to do was sign and everything would be simpler. I told them again that I would not, that the house was mine, but Julia leaned close, her voice dropping to a hiss that chilled me more than any shout. "You think you have a choice," she said. "But one more outburst, one more slip, and we'll call the police right here. They'll take your word against ours, and you know how that ends. So either you sign, or you stay silent." Those words, "stay silent," lodged in my chest like a stone. They were not a request, not even advice, but a command backed by the promise of force, the stripping away of my dignity through the machinery of law. It was then that I understood I had crossed a threshold. There would be no return to the uneasy peace of before, no possibility of reconciling through patience or reason. They had drawn the line, and my silence was to be their weapon. For the first time, I considered calling the police myself, not as a victim of crime in the ordinary sense, but as a man whose very existence was under siege by his own blood. I did not yet know if I would have the courage, but the seed was planted, and with it a flicker of defiance that I thought age had extinguished forever. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd endured before, for the threat that Julia had spoken in a hiss on my porch no longer hovered as an abstract possibility, but began to shape every interaction, every hour of my day, until I felt like a man under siege within the walls of his own home, clinging to dignity while the assault grew sharper and more calculated. At first it came in the form of more frequent visits, always unannounced, as though they meant to remind me that the house was no longer entirely mine, that I lived only on borrowed time. They would let themselves in with a spare key they had kept for years, moving through the rooms without asking permission, Julia opening drawers and cupboards under the guise of tidying, David pacing slowly through the hallways as though inspecting, a property already in his name. I objected once, telling them that if they intended to visit, they should at least call ahead. But David looked at me with that practiced expression of pity mixed with irritation and said quietly, "Dad, you probably just forgot we told you last week." Though I knew with absolute clarity that no such conversation had taken place. It was a simple phrase, but it cut deep, for it was less an excuse than a deliberate attempt to make me question my own memory, to seed doubt where I had always been certain. Soon their tactics grew bolder. Julia began speaking in front of me as though I were already absent, discussing with David whether I could handle another winter in the house, whether it would be better to move me before the snow set in, how expensive it would be to heat the place, when he doesn't even notice the thermostat anymore. I tried to interrupt, to insist that I managed perfectly well, but each protest was met with the same condescending nod, the same reminder that, "We know you mean well, Dad, but you don't see the full picture." My own words, spoken in my own kitchen, bounced back at me like the mutterings of a ghost, heard but dismissed, present yet irrelevant. One afternoon, I discovered that my bank statements had been redirected, the usual envelopes no longer arriving in my mailbox. When I asked at the bank, the teller hesitated before admitting that my son had been in to update the address, claiming it was on my behalf. I managed, after a tense argument with the manager who had known me for decades, to restore the records to my name, but the incident left me shaken, for it showed me just how far they were willing to go, tampering with accounts that held not only my savings, but the last proof of my independence. When I confronted David about it, he did not deny it, but instead raised his voice, accusing me of paranoia, saying that if I continued making wild accusations, he would have no choice but to protect himself by bringing the authorities into the matter. Julia, standing behind him with arms crossed, added coldly, "You're not safe handling money anymore. We're only trying to keep you from making mistakes that could ruin all of us." The audacity of that claim nearly made me laugh, but the laughter died in my throat, replaced by a deep weariness. I had not made a financial mistake in decades. I had lived carefully, saved diligently, provided for my family, even when it meant denying myself small comforts. And now, those very virtues were being twisted into evidence of incapacity, as though prudence were a symptom of disease, as though caution were proof of decline. The injustice of it burned inside me, and yet each time I raised my voice to insist upon my competence, I saw the quick glances they exchanged, the small, satisfied smiles, as though my anger itself were the very confirmation they sought. The escalation turned crueler still when they began moving my belongings. At first it was subtle. A framed photograph of Helen vanished from the mantel. A set of tools I kept in the garage disappeared, small objects that I noticed only because I had touched them daily. Then, larger items began to shift. The armchair in the den relocated without explanation. The old clock wound differently so that it no longer kept proper time. When I asked where these things had gone, Julia would shrug and say she had tidied them away, or David would insist that I must be misremembering where they had been. It was a campaign of erasure, a steady rewriting of my environment designed to make me doubt not only my memory, but the very solidity of my world. Some nights I walked the rooms with a notebook, writing down where each item was placed, terrified that in the morning I would wake to find the house altered again. My notes the only fragile proof that the changes were not in my imagination. The neighbors began to play their part, whether knowingly or not, for one afternoon Mrs. Callahan approached me at the mailbox and asked in a hushed tone whether it was true I had nearly set the kitchen on fire last week. I stared at her in disbelief, insisting that no such thing had happened, that my stove worked fine, but she looked unconvinced, muttering that Julia had mentioned it casually during a conversation about safety. Another man from church stopped me after service to offer help with driving, since it must be difficult to keep the car straight at your age. I had driven without incident only the day before, but already I could see how the stories had spread, how the portrait of incompetence was being painted in careful strokes across the town until soon it would not matter what I said, for the narrative would already be established in the minds of others. The lowest moment of this escalation came during a dinner at their own house, when they insisted I join them as if to show some semblance of family unity. At the table, Julia poured me a glass of water and then, without asking, set aside the wine, saying lightly that alcohol mixed with my medications could be dangerous. I told her I took no medication that forbade it, but David interrupted, raising his voice so the children in the other room would hear, claiming I'd forgotten the doctor's orders. My cheeks burned as though I were a schoolboy being corrected in front of strangers, and I pushed back my chair to leave. That was when Julia leaned close, her voice low and sharp, saying, "Sit down and stop embarrassing us. One more outburst, and I'll call the police right now. They'll take you away for your own good, and you won't be coming back to that house of yours." The words froze me, not because I believed them entirely, but because I knew how easily they could make them true. All it would take was one phone call, one accusation, one display of anger twisted into violence, and I would be at the mercy of systems that did not know me and would rather err on the side of removing a frail old man than risk being accused of neglect. That night, alone in my home, I understood fully the depth of their betrayal. They were not waiting for me to collapse naturally into incapacity. They were engineering it, crafting an image of me as unstable, forgetful, dangerous, until eventually no one would question when they stepped in to take over. It was no longer a battle of documents or signatures, but a war over perception, and I realized with chilling clarity that if I remained passive, if I clung to silence out of fear of escalation, they would win, and I would wake one day to find myself stripped not only of my house, but of the right to speak for myself. I began keeping a journal, documenting every interaction, every missing object, every conversation overheard, filling pages with cramped handwriting that served as both a record and a reassurance that I was still capable of coherence. I kept the notebook hidden beneath the floorboard in the study, terrified they might discover it and twist it into evidence of paranoia. At night, I rehearsed what I might say to the police if I ever called them, weighing whether they would believe me or whether they would arrive only to side with the younger, louder voices of my son and daughter-in-law. The thought tormented me. For silence had been my shield, yet now silence had become my greatest vulnerability, the very condition they demanded of me as proof of obedience. The escalation reached its cruel peak one rainy evening when they arrived again without warning, carrying another envelope and insisting that this time I must sign. I refused, my voice shaking but firm, and Julia slammed her hand on the table, shouting that if I did not comply, she would call the police immediately. David stood behind her, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the screen as though ready to dial. "One word from me," he said, "and you'll be gone by tonight. Don't make us do it, Dad. Just sign and spare us all the trouble." For a moment, I felt my resolve falter, the terror of handcuffs and flashing lights clawing at my chest, but then something stronger stirred within me, a memory of Helen's voice telling me once long ago that silence in the face of injustice is not kindness, but surrender. I looked at my son, at the boy who had grown into a man willing to destroy his father for property, and I felt the tremor in my hands still. I said nothing in that moment, letting them believe I was cowed, but inside I made a decision. The next time they threatened to call the police, I would not wait for their lies to dictate the story. I would call first. The night I finally decided to act was like any other in some ways, but in others, it felt like the sky itself had shifted, as though the weight of my decision hung in the air, making everything seem both sharper and somehow slower. The evening had arrived with its usual quiet, the only sound in the house the ticking of the old clock that Helen had bought when we moved in, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The world outside was dark, rain streaking the windows, the kind of storm that made you feel that things long buried might be dragged to the surface, just like the clouds that gathered in a sky too heavy to hold its own weight. I had sat for hours in the living room, staring at the walls, my hands clenched on the arms of Helen's chair, not just from fear, but from an anger so deep and old that it felt like a separate thing inside me, a fire that had burned quietly in the corners of my soul for years, kept hidden because I was afraid of the damage it might cause. I had told myself over and over again that I would not let them break me, that I would not allow the cruelty of my own blood to dictate the terms of my life. But each time they returned, each time they pushed me a little further into the corner, the anger inside me began to build, to rise, until there was no more room for fear, only the stark clarity of resolve. It was as I sat there, in the silence of the house that I had worked my whole life to create, that I made my decision. I would no longer wait for them to come and claim what they believed to be theirs. I would not let them take the last thing I had, the right to my own voice, the right to my own choices. I had been passive for too long, too afraid of the consequences, too convinced that I could outlast the storm. But the truth was that silence and submission would not stop the tide, and I had no more time to waste. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that if I did not act now, the decision would be taken from me by force, and I would never have the chance to set things right. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the number that I had feared calling for so long, the number that I had avoided because it meant crossing a line I had never imagined I would have to cross. As the phone rang, I felt the weight of what I was doing, but there was something liberating about it too, something that made my chest feel lighter, even as my heart pounded with the adrenaline of what I was about to do. The operator answered, and I was surprised by the calmness in my own voice as I explained the situation. How my son and daughter-in-law were attempting to take control of my home and finances. How they had lied to me, manipulated me, and threatened me with the police. How I feared for my safety and my future. The conversation was short, but in those few minutes I felt a strange sense of clarity that I had never experienced before. When the officer asked if I needed them to come to the house immediately, I hesitated only for a second before answering firmly that yes, I did. There was no longer any room for hesitation. I'd been running from this moment, avoiding it for fear of what might happen, but the reality was that by refusing to act, I was only giving them more power, more control over my life. I hung up the phone and sat back, breathing deeply. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the windows, as though the world itself was aware of the shift that was about to occur. I thought about all the years I had spent building a life, all the sacrifices I had made, all the love I had given, and how quickly it had been dismissed, trampled underfoot by those I had raised and cared for. I thought about Helen, and how she would have stood by me in this moment, how she would have told me to stand up for what was right, to fight for my dignity, even if it meant facing the consequences. The knock at the door came later, just as I had finished making a cup of tea to steady my nerves. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing that once I opened that door, there would be no turning back. I looked once more around the living room, at the pictures on the walls, at the chair where Helen had once sat, and I knew that what I was doing was not just for me, but for everything I had built in this house, for every moment of joy that had been. Overshadowed by the deceit and the manipulation of my own flesh and blood. When I opened the door, I was not surprised to see a uniformed officer standing there, though I did feel a flash of unease at the sight of him. But the unease did not last long, for when he introduced himself and asked if I needed assistance, I knew that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would finally be heard. I invited him inside, and as I led him to the living room, I could see the subtle change in his demeanor, and the way he began to take in the room, the photographs, the quiet dignity of the space that had once been a home. I sat down, and the officer asked me to explain the situation. I told him everything, how David and Julia had come to my house, how they had tried to take control of my affairs, how they had manipulated me with false promises of care and concern, how they had threatened to call the police if I did not comply with their demands. I explained how they had lied to me, how they had tried to paint me as someone incapable of making my own decisions, and how I'd been forced to live under constant pressure and fear. The officer listened carefully, taking notes, and when I finished, he nodded, his expression thoughtful. He asked me if I had any evidence of the threats or coercion, and I handed him the journal I'd kept, the notes detailing every conversation, every shift in behavior, every stolen object, every whispered remark. He flipped through it slowly, and I could see the recognition in his eyes as he realized that this was not just a simple family dispute, but something much more sinister. As I sat there, waiting for him to speak, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, a sense of validation that I had not expected. The officer told me that he would contact David and Julia, that they would have to account for their actions, and that they would be informed of the consequences if they continued with their behavior. For the first time in months, I felt like I was being seen, like my voice mattered, like I was no longer the invisible old man waiting for the world to forget him. The officer left shortly after, promising to follow up with me once the investigation was underway. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it for a moment, my heart still racing. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air fresh and clean, and in that moment I felt something stir within me. Something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, I had taken control of my own fate, and though I did not know how things would unfold, I knew that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, toward standing up for myself in a way I never had before. The house was still, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But the silence now felt different, no longer oppressive, no longer a reminder of my isolation. It was a silence filled with possibility, a silence that held the weight of the truth and the promise of justice. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I might just be able to hold on to what was mine, that I might just be able to protect the last bit of dignity I had left. In the days that followed, the weight of the decision I had made hung over me like a cloud, and yet each time I allowed myself a moment to reflect on what had transpired, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though a part of me that had been buried for far too long had finally found its voice. David and Julia had not returned to the house, and though I knew it was only a matter of time before they would try again, I also knew that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Their plan had been to break me, to wear me down with isolation and manipulation until I surrendered what was mine. But instead, I had chosen to fight, and in that fight, something had changed within me. I had become something they had not expected. A person with agency, a person with the power to stand up and say no. And though the path ahead would be difficult, It was mine to walk, not theirs to decide. The police officer had followed through with his promise. He contacted David and Julia, and I could only imagine the tension that filled their home when they learned that their lies had been exposed. I did not know the details of their conversation, but I could sense the panic in their voices when they had called me to discuss things calmly, as if pretending that their earlier threats had been forgotten. I did not pick up the phone, and I did not respond to the letters they sent in the weeks that followed. Each letter contained a plea for forgiveness, a request for me to reconsider, but I knew it for what it was. A desperate attempt to regain control over a situation they no longer had the upper hand in. The community, too, had begun to shift. The whispers that had once surrounded me, the pity and judgment, gradually gave way to understanding. I received a letter from Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who had once asked me about the supposed fire in the kitchen. She apologized, writing that she had heard things from David and Julia, but now understood that the truth was far more complicated than she had been led to believe. It was a small gesture, but it meant something I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. It meant that the walls they had tried to build around me, the walls that made me feel like a stranger in my own life, were beginning to crumble. The first time I saw David after everything had unfolded was at the courthouse. He was there with Julia, and though I knew I would have to face them eventually, nothing could have prepared me for the coldness in their eyes, the way they looked at me as though I were an obstacle they had to navigate around, not a person they had once called family. There was no warmth in their greeting, no acknowledgement of the years we had spent together, only the sterile politeness of two people caught in the fallout of their own schemes. When I saw them standing in the hallway of the courthouse, I felt a strange calm wash over me, as though I had already won the battle, as though I had already taken back what was mine. The judge had ruled in my favor, stating that while the process of contesting the power of attorney was ongoing, it was clear that I had been subjected to undue pressure and manipulation. It was a small victory, but it was mine. David attempted to speak to me then, his voice low, almost pleading. He asked if I would reconsider, if I would let him and Julia help me find a way to move forward, but I could see the cracks in his facade, the way his words trembled under the weight of his own guilt. For the first time, I saw him not as my son, but as someone who had been willing to sacrifice everything for his own gain, someone who had lost his way in the pursuit of something that should never have been his to take. I looked at him and I said only one thing. "I'm not your project, David." "You've already taken enough." Julia stood a little apart from him, her face hard and unmoving. She did not speak, though I could feel the anger in her gaze, the fury at being exposed, at having her carefully constructed image shattered. I did not care for her anger, for I knew it was a reflection of her own fear, the fear that she might lose everything she thought she could control. I had no intention of speaking to her any longer. Whatever love I had once felt for her had been eroded by the years of manipulation, and now I knew that nothing she said would change the reality of what she had done. The confrontation was brief, no more than a few minutes, but as I walked away from them, back toward the courthouse doors, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of closure that I had not anticipated. It was as if, by standing my ground, by refusing to be reduced to a helpless old man, I had reclaimed more than just my home. I had reclaimed my dignity, my autonomy, my very sense of self. For so long, I had allowed their expectations, their threats, to shape the way I saw myself, but now I saw clearly that I was more than their victim, more than the story they had tried to write about me. I was my own person, and I had the right to live my life on my terms. The days after the courthouse were quiet, and I allowed myself to savor the stillness. The phone calls from David and Julia tapered off, replaced by the silence that had once been my greatest enemy, but now felt like peace. I spent my time walking the yard, tending to the garden that Helen had loved, remembering her laughter as we planted the first rose bush in the corner, back when our lives felt endless, when we could imagine a future that stretched far beyond the horizon. I would never forget her, and I would never forget the love we had shared, but I knew that moving forward, I had to let go of the past in order to live fully in the present. And so, the house remained mine, a small but significant victory in a world that had often felt too large to conquer. The legal battle over the power of attorney continued, but I knew now that the outcome was no longer in doubt. I would not be made a fool of, nor would I allow myself to be dismissed as someone less than capable. The life I had built, brick by brick, was mine to protect, and no one could take that from me, not even the people who had once called me family. In the end, I realized that the most important thing was not the house itself, nor the money, nor even the legal victory. The most important thing was that I had fought for myself, that I had found my voice again, and that, despite everything, I had refused to be silenced. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset through the trees, I felt a deep sense of peace, a peace that had eluded me for years. I was no longer afraid of the darkness, no longer afraid of being forgotten. I had taken back my life, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the one thing that truly mattered: my freedom.